thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me today to speak with you. This is I haven't given this talk a lot because the data are still sort of fresh and getting published. So feel free, to interrupt me as we go along. I'm going to try to leave time so we can have a talk at the end. But, Michelle, you're exactly right. I'm going to just give you a brief background of who I am and how I got here. I went to a small liberal arts college outside Philadelphia, Swarthmore College, and I majored in art history and biology. I was pretty much a closet pre-med. I got excited by research in medical school, and it was clinical research, but my mentors were wonderful. And they said, no, you have to learn how to be a scientist, a basic scientist to get NIH funding. And I think they were probably right. So I took a year out of residency, which was very radical at the time. And my beloved mentor was an infectious disease specialist, and he put me on his T32 in infectious diseases. And I got my K award when I was a chief resident and stayed on the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, where I was for many, many years before I came to UCSF in 2015. And I've always had a clinical practice where I saw patients and did surgeries, usually about 2 days a week. When I came to UCSF, my administrative job was so big that I took a hiatus, although I got a California license, and now I'm back to seeing patients 1 day a week. I got married as a PGY3, and I had my first child as a chief resident, my second child as a junior faculty member. I need to move every day to be happy. It's the way I deal with anxiety. So I exercise every day. I like to quilt. I like to read. I like to cook. And, the bottom line is that we're all told we can't do these things by people who don't do them really. And the lesson I've learned over time is just to accept whatever I view as imperfect and identify, as I've illustrated, what makes me happy and do those things every day because they will keep you happy. And the journey can be challenging. So how do I look back on the key decisions? So in medical school, I really decided I wanted to be an academician, and I can't really tell you exactly why. I spent a day as an ENT resident in a private practice office. And while I really liked the person who I was shadowing, it didn't seem like that would be the life for me. And, my dear friend, Fred Brancati, who sadly died of ALS about a decade ago, he published a wonderful article in JAMA and noting that medical students who publish first author papers often go into academia statistically significantly more than those who don't. So it was so exciting to publish that paper as a medical student and think about how the work that I was doing actually could have an impact beyond the patients that I was able to see. I mentioned I took time out to do research. I have really been blessed to have wonderful mentors. I got married and had children when it was not convenient. I limited my travel to key meetings, and I learned how to say no to things. When you get asked early on, your instinctive response is, yes, you like me. But then you realize, let me balance this out in the scheme of things. And I still today rely on some very close friends to help me figure out what I should agree to do and what is worthwhile saying no thank you to. Nobody taught me about academic promotions, except I did come from an academic family. My dad was a professor and a dean in arts and sciences, so I understood what promotion and tenure was about, and I really thought about that. I learned how to write. I learned how to review. Reviewing helped me write. And I focused my research always on work that I was sure was important and I could justify being the person who was doing that work. And that can be a little bit tricky as a surgeon scientist. So these are the babies. I'll show you pictures at the end. They're not babies anymore. But, I had been, when I was a chief resident, it was really hard for me emotionally because I was the first woman in the residency program. Of course, nobody else was having babies and returning to work. But we had wonderful nannies. My father retired and helped out, and some live-in help as well early on. And then Anna was actually at a placenta previa. She was preemie. She was in the ICU for a little while. It was really scary, but I had a ton of support, and that really helped me be a mom to little ones and able to engage in my career. And I love this picture. My husband gets mortified when I show it, but this is at our daughter's bat mitzvah. The children still say that it's very embarrassing to watch me dance, but it's humiliating to watch their father dance because he's quite the sweaty boy. But we still are having a great time and enjoying each other. I feel very lucky that I married the right person. So once I got a full professor with tenure, I relaxed a little bit and I said, okay, there's no more ladder to climb. Why am I here? Like, what am I going to do that's going to actually make a difference for other people? I don't have to worry about my own career anymore. And at this point, I really processed that I was atypical. I use the word unicorn. And at this point, more women were going into surgery. They were interested in otolaryngology. And I did so much research, and I'd stayed in the same place for medical school and residency, and it was where I was from. So I wasn't sure my experiences were very illustrative of everybody else's. So I did a study. That's what you do when you're a researcher. And so this was a survey study. It was back in the time, really before email. So we sent a 20-page questionnaire. It was a statistically validated questionnaire that had been used to study women surgeons in Canada. It was 121 questions. We modified it for otolaryngology, and I surveyed all 504 women ear, nose, and throat doctors in the country at the time, and matched each woman with 2 men who were around the same age and were practicing the same region of the country. And I was really surprised by the results. Women were less happy and were paid 20% less, despite looking at every which way possible to explain the difference in compensation. They were more likely to be divorced or childless, express regret about their career, and experience discrimination and harassment. And at the time, I thought, well, the message is keep your eyes wide open and advocate for yourself. And naively, I thought, well, we publish it and that will make a difference. And then lo and behold, in 2019, Erin O'Brien, who is an otolaryngologist at the Mayo Clinic, reported that the pay gap still existed for women in otolaryngology, and that despite my publication in 2004, more data suggests this pay disparity persisted. And I thought, oh my goodness, why is this still happening? And then you look at the NIH, and Tim Lay is one of my favorite people. He's at WashU, and at this point, he was running the MD PhD program. And Tim really did a Herculean effort to gather the data and basically identified that women scientists stop applying for grants at around the late postdoctoral fellow, early faculty years. And this hadn't changed one bit over time. And so Tim and I have had a lot of conversations. I served as a consultant for the NIH for 2 years, ending last month. And the bottom line is, if you look at the data today, nothing has changed. Essentially, the advancement of women to senior faculty ranks and leadership positions isn't altered. We'll talk about that data. The NIH is granting awards to women in proportion to their application rate. So at the end of the day, the NIH says, what can we do if only 20% of the applications from institution X are from women, and we're giving 20% of the grants to women? Aren't we doing our job? And so the real question is, how do we alert institutions that they have a gender disparity in applications, and how do we help address that problem? This is a really thorny question. I'm happy to talk about it. But this was a very depressing paper. It came out in November of 2020. And the actual numbers of women who are full professors, the actual number of women chairs, the actual number of women deans has incrementally risen. And the dogma is that it's a matter of a pipeline. And as the pipeline increases, it's a passive force, and these numbers will continue to go up. But this article was really smart, and they actually looked at the denominator. And what they found when they looked at the data and they considered the number of women who were plausible candidates for promotion was that over a 35-year period, women physicians in academic medical centers were less likely than men to be promoted or be appointed to department chair. And again, just like the NIH funding curves and my salary discrepancy data, there was no evidence that this gap was narrowing over time. So I managed to be a surgeon by pretending I wasn't a woman. That sounds a little strange, but if I called too much attention to my gender, it really was a liability in terms of being trained well and in fitting in. I was stunned when I matched in otolaryngology and I became an intern in surgery. There were 19 interns and I was the only woman. I had never before, been the only woman in the group. And it was a ride. And I had to learn how to take care of patients and do procedures. There was lots of gendered behavior from faculty, from colleagues, flirting, harassment, worse. Maybe I stuck it out by having grit or resilience, although those weren't terms I would have used to describe myself. I think I did a lot of personal gaslighting, to be quite honest, because I really didn't have the capacity to reckon with it. There really was no one to talk to about it. It wasn't clear there was anything to be done. And one of the reasons I think I became a scientist, in addition to being a surgeon, was it seemed like a more level playing field, and gender seemed to me at the time to be less of a liability or an issue. And there were metrics. I could write public papers and get grants. Although as a scientist, as many of you who are my age know, there weren't a lot of women as well. I grew accustomed to being the only woman on really important search committees, on panels at scientific conferences. And I thought, well, I'm just going to be really good. And if I'm really good, that will pave the way for others. And bad things happened to me that were sort of harrowing, but because I'd stayed at the same institution forever, I had really powerful mentors who protected me when bad things happened, until I came to a new institution where I didn't have that posse and I wasn't able to be protected. And I started this work that I'm going to talk about now because I realized that if someone like me could be subjected to discrimination and harassment because of my gender, it really could happen to anybody, and I needed to understand why. So when I moved from Western Pennsylvania to Northern California, it was really surprising to me that the climate for the few women in leadership at UCSF was not any rosier than it was back in Western Pennsylvania. So I was baffled by, the struggles that I saw them experience, what I witnessed in my own life. And I started reaching out to Arlie Russell Hochschild, who's just a wonderful sociologist and writer at UC Berkeley, to get her advice about how could I go about studying this problem? How could I make sense of it? And then when I tumbled out of my leadership position because the harassment grew overwhelming, I reached out to sociologists at UCSF and learned how to be a qualitative researcher. So thank you, Dan Dohan, my collaborator, and he helped me do this IRB approved study. And around the time that I was putting the study together, this publication came out from the National Academies, Sexual Harassment of Women. And these were the conclusions. This was the end of 2018. You can see that there are 5 factors that they studied that they thought created conditions for harassment in science and medicine. And I won't enumerate them here, but it's a good report. It's a sobering report. But one of the understandable consequences of being harassed is it's not very much fun to come to work, and people withdraw from the organization. Further, when women reported being harassed, they felt that their experience was minimized or normalized. And when they told people, they often were greeted with no response or no action, which actually worsened the situation, or they were retaliated against. And I found this to be quite the case when I did my interview study. I want to remind us, though, that It's not that one gender is good and one gender is bad. This was a brilliant study designed by Jo Handelsman when she was at Yale. And I'm sure many of you know about this study, but they sent CVs, identical CVs, although in some cases the person was named John, in other cases it was Jennifer. They sent these CVs to women and male scientists at Ivy League institutions, and they asked them if they would be more likely to hire these people and what they would pay them. And both women and men scientists preferred John over Jennifer. And they offered John more money to come and work for them. So this was a real eye-opener in terms of unconscious bias that I think we all have to understand we suffer from. So this is my study, the study that I undertook in 2019. I think I've articulated the persistent problem. We recognize these disparities. The National Academy's report was just one example of the field recognizing that this exists. So what I decided to do was record and then analyze the experiences and perspectives of a representative cohort of men and women in science and medicine at various stages in their careers. So I didn't know the pandemic was coming. I was lucky to get all this in 2019. And I carried out in-person, semi-structured, recorded interviews with 52 men and 52 women at 16 different universities around the country. I tried to seek diversity in terms of geographic location, public and private institutions, and institutional prestige as measured by NIH and US News and World Report rankings. I promised everybody anonymity because the information they were sharing with me was quite provocative. And so I can't identify the institutions for you. But I can show you what the cohort looked like, and I will talk about the work that we have published and what's in progress. I prioritized looking at meeting with senior people because I felt that they had a long view that was potentially more informative for this kind of research than junior faculty would be. So I got verbal IRB approval from everybody, and each interview lasted about an hour. And I essentially explored with each interviewee how gender impacted their career, both personally and what they saw all around them. And I love this quote because I think it exemplifies why we've been stuck. You know, we hear about these outrageous data. Institutions get very they're pressured to do something, and so they implement a policy, or they identify their culture or their mission, and they don't stop and try to understand why is it this way. So I did this work because I think that the quick solutions aren't working because we don't fully understand the problem. So that's what I tried to do. So I carried out the interviews. They were recorded and then transcribed. And then with my sociologist colleagues, we developed codes based on the literature and then salient features in the first 10 interviews. We had 2 sets of codes that we used for each interview. Academic medicine ecosystem codes, and you can look at them there, but they're essentially elements related to our work. And then what we ended up calling gender-related bad stuff codes, because we really couldn't find any other name that we all agreed makes sense. And here is the category of gender-related bad stuff. And then we looked at the intersection between the academic medicine ecosystem and gender-related bad stuff. So this is what the cohort looked like. And if you ask me, why did I stop at 104? It's because I stopped hearing anything new. I mean, the characters may have changed, but the themes were durable and consistent. And so we call that saturation. So I felt like we was saturated. I was lucky. I mean, if I'd had to do this once the pandemic hit, I would have had to switch to Zoom. And I can tell you that I think there was something really remarkable about being in their office at their institution. I think they were comfortable in a way that may not have been true had we done it via Zoom, but I don't really know that. So you can see that the age of the men and the women was about the same, equal numbers of men and women, roughly equal numbers of MDs and PhDs. The men were more likely to be full professors, but not a whole lot more. The men were, of course, far more likely to have leadership positions or have endowed chairs, which was something that I could actually measure. So to date, we've published 3 papers. The third paper, I don't believe you can read yet, so I'm going to go into it a little bit more detail because it's just accepted a couple of weeks ago. And this is the Lancet Open Access Journal, and it's about networking. The paper on promotion and tenure really focused on women because, as I mentioned to Michelle when we started, the men, with one exception, didn't report any struggles with promotion and tenure. So it ended up being a women-focused manuscript. The mentoring, of course, focused on both men and women. So when I was going to medical school, the dogma was that we choose our fields based on how much medical school debt we have. And that turns out to be not true. We really choose our professions based on our mentors. So mentoring has been known for a very long time to really make a critical difference. And so these were the key findings. And when I talk about key findings, I asked people about their experiences being mentored, and I asked about their experiences being mentors. So what I heard was that women, but not men, reported being sexually harassed by their mentors. Both women and men became aware of gender inequities in medicine through relationships with their women mentors and mentees. So this was beneficial. Both women and men mentors recognized the challenges that their women mentees faced and made deliberate efforts to help them navigate what they thought was an inequitable environment. And both women and men mentors tried to model work-family balance and create family-friendly environments for their trainees. I put this up because I think it illustrates the disconnect between what we believe, what we say we believe, and what happens in our own backyard. So this was a New England Journal paper published in late 2019. It was really ingenious. These authors built in a survey, an online survey at the end of the annual in-service exam that surgical residents around the country are required to take every year. So 97% of the surgical residents in the country agreed to participate in this study. And what they found was that attending surgeons, that is the faculty members, were the most frequent sources of sexual harassment. 27% of the trainees were being harassed, and abuse, almost 52%. So this came out during the course of my interview study. So I was in the office of a senior male surgeon who is a leader in his department. And I asked him what he thought about this paper. And he really was genuinely appalled by it, talked about how disappointed he was with the data. And then I said, well, what have you done in your department in response to this paper? And he was just baffled, by the question. And I said, you do realize that your residents were subjects in the study, right? And he didn't. And I think that illustrates the difficulty of reconciling our awareness or lack of awareness of what's happening all around us, even when we're faced with data that should cause us to put up some mirrors in our own homes. So with respect to the promotion and tenure paper, and again, it was only women that I reported on, they felt that they had ambiguous or inconsistent criteria that were provided for promotion and tenure. There was a lack of standard processes for reviewing their tenure applications and making decisions. And they were vulnerable to malicious behavior of senior faculty, division chiefs, and department chairs. And they can see that their male colleagues had a completely different experience. So I am not going to go through all these quotes because I want to save time for our conversation, but these are real people. And so in addition to these quotes in these papers, what I've now done is I've written up their stories. I give them pseudonyms so they can't be identified. And I've written a book, and I feel so lucky I was able to find a literary agent, and she's now shopping the book proposal to publishers in the hopes that will be able to get these stories out there, because what I heard was really heartbreaking. It helped me put my experiences in perspective and help me really understand why we're stuck, because we don't have the language to talk about these things at work with the people who need to hear about these things. So these are just some more concerns and quotes about the sub-themes. And you're welcome. Happy. I know that you guys have looked at this article, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm going to spend more time on the networking. I just want to focus on theme 3, because from my point of view, this was the most egregious. This was impossible to recover from. So when we are dependent on the gatekeeper, and if the gatekeeper is our division chief or our department chair, to be advanced or granted tenure, and that person is actively working against us, you either have to suck it up and or find someone more powerful in the institution who can help you. And, you know, what I heard from a few women was just harrowing stories of going to people who were in positions of power, generally in the provost's office, and essentially being told they just had to deal with it. They really weren't granted much help. And this last one, where the chairman realized the only way he could get rid of this woman, and the only reason he wanted to get rid of her, is he didn't have the money to pay her, and the institution was holding him accountable to his offer letter, which he couldn't. He didn't want to give that money to her anymore. He put her up for tenure early without her approval, and when she was denied tenure, she had to leave. So it was really heartbreaking. Luckily, I met her after she'd gotten her act together and found employment at another institution, but it was just harrowing to hear how people can sometimes use their power to be so harmful to others. And ironic to me as a physician scientist that this isn't a field that's about healing. And we certainly aren't healing people when we behave this way. Again, these are all quotes in the paper, but it shows you that the analysis came from real people talking about real experiences. So this paper I'm going to spend a few more minutes on because it's not out yet. I just went through the proofs last week. But what was fascinating about networking in science and medicine is everybody saw it. The women talked about it, the men talked about it. And at the end of the day, the themes were that women were regularly excluded from networking activities that were dominated by men. Both women and men really comfortably talked about the boys' club, and they believed, both of them, that it conferred benefits to people in the club. And if you weren't in the club, you were excluded from such benefits. Many people talked about how they leveraged this club to get ahead. And women tried their best to make efforts to counteract exclusion, but they identified the limits of those efforts. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there were other patterns of gender-related exclusion that were not related to the boys' club. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we found. So here are some of the sub-themes. So even if the boys' club cannot be defined, it exists. And so in each of these quotes, which again, I realize we don't have time to marinate in here, a woman or a man talked about the boys' club and how it really mattered to be in it. And they also talked about how these boys' clubs advantaged men and disadvantaged women. I spoke to one interviewee, really sticks out in my mind, a woman chair at a big department at an elite institution, is really an accomplished academician. And I asked her, how she liked her job, sort of like an icebreaker. And she said, "Oh my God, I never thought that golf would be so important, and I don't golf." And I'm like, that's a joke, right? But it really wasn't a joke. And, she shared experiences like, the leadership of the institution going out for fundraising activities, and it all being around a golf event, which she was excluded from and excluded from all the other parties linked to the golf event. And that's where they made the important decisions. And she learned about these decisions later. I also talked to men who innocently, I believe, described how much they liked, fishing and hunting and golfing, and that this is where they bonded with the leaders. And it wasn't their fault that the women didn't want to come. They were welcome, but they just chose not to come. So I think it was really, it was eye-opening to me how everybody sees it, but they look at the elephant from different points of view. And it's hard to know who really is accountable. And because many of these activities happen outside the physical confines of universities, it's a little bit more challenging to hold the university accountable, but I think that we can. We talked a little bit about the golf course and the pervasiveness of the network. So I'm going to go on to some of the other themes here. And again, I think this is these quotes just go on, and they're real people. And they all viewed that these networking activities helped them, and the ones who were not able to participate in hurt them. Women tried. I interviewed so many women, and I certainly have done the same thing and been part of the same activities in my life. When you see that you're excluded, you create a network of women, and this happens organically at study section, et cetera. And you can support each other, you can share experiences. But when these women's networks are not empowered in the same way that the male networks are, ultimately it's not clear precisely what we can accomplish. And then a few women talked about being excluded from these women's networks. In particular, I happened to interview a number of women who didn't have children, and they volunteered that they were not part of the mommy club, and they were often asked to, take on responsibilities that the women with children were not asked to take on, and that made them feel excluded. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for us to talk. So what keeps me here, this for me was a healing journey to do this work. It's still exciting to talk with people like you about, to make it visible. But I stay active as a researcher and a clinician because it's so exciting, to discover something, and particularly when you see that it can help many people beyond your own little world. I love interacting with colleagues like you and trainees, and I really do hope that our work will make a difference in the end. So the take-home points, I think, from this work is what I saw is we consolidate power in very few places, and what I mean by places are people. And there is not sufficient transparency or accountability to really identify places where we can address gender and other kinds of inequity. I also want to make sure I say a word about intersectionality. I did not power this research to really look at other populations who are underrepresented in science and medicine. And when I happened to meet with someone of color, a man or a woman, or someone who came from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background, or a person who was non-binary in terms of gender identity, it was very clear to me that there's an intersectionality of being underrepresented, and it just contributes to feeling excluded and frankly being excluded. But I would like to point out that I think that women in academic medicine are the canary in the coal mine. And what I mean by that is we are equal in number. And the mantra, again, has been, well, once there's enough people in the pipeline, everything will fall into place. But women have made up half of graduate school classes in biomedical sciences and half of medical school classes for at least a decade or more. And there really isn't any evidence that those equal numbers have led to substantial inroads. And that's the point of focusing on gender in this study. What I saw was that men are persistently advantaged and women persistently disadvantaged after they get into the club. This is true in terms of startup packages, in terms of retention offers. I mean, I'll just go on my high horse for a minute and say, we don't have any data about retention because it's not written down. There's nowhere I can go at UCSF, for example, to get data on who is retained and what they are offered, so we can even begin to examine it for inequities. And when I met with people who were in charge of putting together retention offers, they all admitted that men were far more likely to go out and get a competing offer and then get a retention offer. And that has to do with lots of sociologic forces way beyond science and medicine. And when I asked, well, what do you do if a retention offer includes more resources, higher compensation? How do you address the resultant inequities with the rest of the people on your faculty? And most people threw up their hands and said, we don't have any way of doing it. A couple people had some really creative ways of handling it. Happy to talk about it afterwards. And I did meet one woman who pointed out her beloved chair, who voluntarily gave her more resources when he realized he had given resources to someone he saw as equally talented or less talented than he saw her. Policies alone will not lead to durable change. And perhaps the policy that's been in place the longest is expanding the tenure clock. These policies were put in place long ago to address the fact that childbearing and child rearing years often overlap with career building and going up for tenure. Most institutions have made these policies gender agnostic. And there was a wonderful article about a year and a half ago in an economics journal that pointed out that what these policies did was enabled men to take advantage of the policies without the accompanying requirements that they had for childbearing or child rearing. And so it did not lead to any improved or closing of that gap of gender in promotion and tenure. But maybe the personal message that I think is really important to convey is when something bad is happening to you, please know you're not alone. Find someone you can talk to. If it can feel terribly shameful. I certainly felt that way when these bad things were happening to me. But go to the people that you trust, who you know, and you will find a much needed audience. The only way to recover from these experiences is with the support of your loved ones. If you do see something bad happening to someone else and you feel that you have the power, say something or do something. If you don't feel like you have the power in that moment, and in the hierarchical system that we live and work in, you may not feel like you have the power, just taking that person aside, later on and saying, I saw that, and how did that feel? I'll give you an example. A few years ago, we were going through an effort to have a capital campaign. And there were all the leaders at UCSF in a room, maybe 50 of us. And a woman volunteered an idea for a theme for the capital campaign. And there was no obvious reaction. Maybe 10 minutes later, you know where this is going. Oh, a man essentially said the same thing. And there was widespread, endorsement and applause and, attaboying. And so afterwards, I was walking with the woman. I said, I want you to know, I heard you say that. And in retrospect, I wish I had had the courage to speak up and said, yes, that's a great idea. And, so-and-so said that 10 minutes ago, because we either don't process it or we don't have the ability to do something, but in the moment is always more effective. But at the end of the day, I think we need a language and a space that is safe from retaliation to really talk about what we are experiencing every day. So back to family, here they are all grown up. I'm so lucky, that the kids moved to San Francisco after my husband and I relocated. And I'm just, quick update. My daughter's matching. She's a fourth-year medical student here, so she's going to match in pediatrics sometime next Friday. And so we'll be excited to see where she goes. And our son works at a startup company here. But it's so great to have my adult children living in the same city and living on their own successfully. But this is why it matters. Catalin Carrico is now winning prizes, and the University of Pennsylvania is so proud of the fundamental RNA biology work that she did that enabled the RNA vaccines that have saved so many lives, including probably many of ours. But the truth is that she was balkanized. She was isolated. She nearly lost her job time and again. She was not in the tenure track. She did not have her own laboratory. She did not have her own resources. She could not get her grants funded. And it was only because a very nice colleague in neurosurgery offered her a bench in his lab to keep working that she was able to prevail. But we don't know the kind of science that is being done by women under duress that isn't going to go well because they are deprived of resources and they are being discriminated against and harassed. And we don't know the consequences of losing all these people who choose to leave academia. So I'd like to end with this optimistic note. Good luck. And I'm really at this point happy to take any questions. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. That was wonderful and somewhat depressing, but also empowering in ways because we're talking about it, right? And that's the first step. So I would love to open this up to other people. If anyone has a question, one thing that I would just ask as people are gaining their confidence or hitting their unmute buttons, is there one or a handful of bullet points that we would take to our leaders to say, here's what we need to think about?
Yeah, good question. So I'm now chairing a key committee at UCSF where I have the right to start these conversations. And what I'm asking for is, where are the data? Let's look at the data. Where is the evidence? What does our equity look like for gender and underrepresented individuals in medicine when it comes to real resources, space, endowed chairs, promotion and tenure, time for promotion and tenure? Because if institutions are prompted, and most of the time they are forced to by law, gather the data, compensation, of course, is a big one. It at least is the beginning of a data-driven conversation, and it can mitigate some of the understandable emotions that can enter into play. So I think that leaders, and I think that, the bottom line is in this era of endorsement of diversity, equity, inclusion, there's not a single institutional leader that's going to push back that this is important. And so if you present yourself as a partner who really cares about the institution and cares about the life of the people who study and work there, I think that's a reasonable beginning.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else have a question or a comment? Dr. Sanchez.
Hi, I'm Katie Reyes in the Department of Anesthesiology, and I'm actually in Dr. Sanchez's office. But I had two questions for you, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. The first is, you talked about earlier in your career about being a recipient of gendered behavior. And I was wondering if you have had any challenges in quantifying or qualifying that type of behavior for research purposes, or to demonstrate that at institutional level. And then my other question is, and sorry to give you that burden, you talked a little bit about thinking that you can hold universities accountable for situations in which decisions are made in these exclusive, after hours events that women are not invited to. And I was just wondering what your ideas around that were.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for those questions. Well, I think it's difficult, but I think if we don't try, it's impossible. So the only places and institutions that gather these data are far from perfect. I mean, it's sort of the typical Title IX, Title VII offices. There may be someone in the dean's office. The few places that I went to that I felt potentially were better was when the Uber boss, that is the absolute, leader, the president, or, in some cases it was the dean of the medical school, said, I really care about this. And so I'm going to keep a non-public list of accusations. And when I see that someone is a frequent offender or a repeat offender, I'm going to pay attention to this, because There are so many privacy policies. There, victims have rights. We've seen such a sea change in this country. I'm not sure it's for the better in terms of students and harassment and culture of rape on campus, and the rights of the accused and the rights of the accuser. So these are really complicated, thorny situations, but I think you need the strategy I would take is find the most senior person who is willing to look at the evidence and figure out where the evidence is and how it can be gathered in a compliant and sensitive way with the goal of making institutional changes. I will tell you that I only happened to meet one woman who had the courage to report being sexually harassed by her postdoc mentor. And it went to a committee, and the committee found that because he didn't demand, because she wasn't punished when he wanted to have sex with her, that he wasn't guilty. It was like the wackiest thing I could imagine. So she had to actually stay in his lab. She had 3 children. It was a small city. They couldn't get up and leave. And she was really blocked by getting a tenure track position, because she had spoken out and had registered a complaint. So it's understandable that most people don't talk about. I don't think there certainly were no Title IX or Title VII offices when I was being harassed as a junior trainee. But I think you have to ask. I think if you can design the studies and you can go back and do qualitative research, and you can interview people and you can ask them about their experiences. And if you interview enough people and you promise them confidentiality, you can gather it. But I think the bottom line is, at the end of the day, the institution has to be willing to really grapple with it and do something about it.
Okay, did you get both of those questions there? I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, make sure. Second question was?
I think the second question was more related to when women are excluded from outside events.
Yeah.
Important decisions are made. How
do you do that? Right. Yeah, good question. So
thank you for your answer, by the way.
Oh, sure. So one of the most extraordinary stories, and I can talk about this, is I was interviewing someone who works at a different institution from the one I work at. I did not interview people at my institution because I did not think that would be a comfortable thing to do. And they talked about a departmental retreat that happened at UCSF about, let's say, 15 to 20 years ago. And the retreat took place. So this was a sanctioned departmental retreat, and it took place at a hot springs resort in Northern California. And one of the activities was going in the hot springs naked. And the people there were male faculty and female graduate students. No female faculty showed up. They had all gotten the memo. And I was shocked. And the woman who I was talking to had been a graduate student. And I said, well, how did it make you feel? And of course, it made her feel absolutely awful. And she described what it actually felt like to take off her clothes and walk into the hot springs with certain people looking at her. And I asked her how she talked about it with her fellow female graduate students. And she said they didn't. They were so ashamed. They were so mortified that they did not even have the language to talk about it. They talk about it today. So I couldn't quite believe, that even UCSF, like, how could they do that? So I came back and I was having lunch with a senior male faculty member who had been in that department. And I said, I heard this wacky story. He goes, oh yeah, that happened. and so what I would say is these things still happen, maybe probably not as egregious as that. That is really, I think, over the top. But you have to go back to the people who are in charge of the institution and say, we can't do this. You can't have a golf outing that excludes people who don't golf, no matter what their gender or race. You can't do that. There has to be some kind of event. And if people want to golf on their own, that's something that can't be, institutionally sanctioned. So that's my idea. Sorry to take up so much time.
Okay, Dr. Wang.
Hi, I'm Mingli Wang. I'm from the Department of Surgery. I really enjoyed your talk. My question is, as you know, in the in surgery, there's still a lot of white men who kind of hold the power, and I'm very interested in mentorship, and I think that is really important for career advancement as well as psychosocial support. And I'm wondering, in this age of kind of the Me Too movement, how some white men, I mean, I've definitely heard this, have felt like, well, I don't really want to be in a room alone with a woman, let alone a minority woman. And I only want to do this during like office hours. And it becomes like, very limiting for women and underrepresented minorities. And I was wondering if you could, give me some advice about how to get around this problem, and, actually help other women in my department kind of get around this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You're absolutely right. And I think the beauty is that we can now talk about it. So what Mike Pence did for the world is he normalized this conversation. And I think that it's really important to point out the consequences to women of not being welcome in these mentoring spaces. So either the mentoring spaces need to change so that everybody feels safe, or there needs to be a frank and honest conversation about the gendered and sexist underpinnings of how we do business. So, and what I would say is, I didn't really meet very many villains, when I did this talk, and I've encountered very few villains in my career. I did meet a few heroes. But what I want to say is we can't rely on the heroes, because when they're gone, everything usually goes back. I heard this many, many times, and I've seen it many, many times, is if there is, let's say, as you point out, a white man who's in a position of leadership, and he is really deliberately hiring women chairs or women deans, or, changing gender equity. If he doesn't, if procedures and policies and transparency and accountability measures aren't put in place, it will drift back. So if you can have the conversation based on, again, data, you can talk about how you feel. That's totally important in certain places. But if there's evidence that your male colleagues are being mentored, frankly, at strip clubs. I heard this a lot. I mean, there was a lot of conversation, particularly from the surgeons, and they went to strip clubs to socialize. And if a woman chose to join them, she was somehow ridiculed for choosing to do that, even though the consequence of not going meant she was left out completely. Then I think it's really okay to say, okay, this is probably not the kinds of mentoring environments that we want to have. And we're all guilty of this in science. I mean, how many, bars have we had at scientific meetings? And, and again, the retreat I told you about was a basic science department retreat at UCSF. I mean, there's no, surgeons are not the only bad guys. They're just probably a little bit more cavalier and open and honest about that. And I also want to say something about backlash. Backlash is real. And I think one of the wonderful parts about me doing this study is everybody I met with trusted me, and they said things like, I can't believe you said that, but they did. And I heard from more than one senior white man who'd been in leadership a long time that he was really upset about the backlash and what were the implications for people like him. And so I think we have to stop judging language as good or bad and just accept that it's all real. And we have to make our environment safe so that he can say what he feels and you can say how you feel. And we have an environment where that conversation can actually be mediated. And increasingly, I think institutions are doing it, but they're not scaling it. They're kind of doing it in, training or something like that. It doesn't necessarily normalize the conversation in those day-to-day environments where people bump up against being silenced or ignored or worse.
Thank you. Dr. Mathis.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. It was really illuminating. I'm going to read all those papers. They look very fascinating. So as a postdoctoral research fellow in a department where majority of our faculty are white men, it's been really hard to find the kind of mentorship that I as a woman would like to
Yep.
have. So I would like to kind of ask about your opinions on the kind of bottom up, because I feel like all of your papers are top down, which are really important. I think it's important to examine how women are being promoted to tenure and advancing through faculty positions. But as a woman who actually has the ability to mentor younger graduate students who are also, like me, a first generation college student, first generation graduate student, I was wondering if you had any kind of words of wisdom for me in my beginning, career trajectory as potentially looking for faculty positions, and how I can be a mentor for other women in my position.
Thank you so much. What a bunch of great questions. So what I would say, first of all, most of my mentors were men, because there weren't any women. And so I had amazing mentorship from women. So sometimes the gender or the color of one's skin or their racial or ethnic background doesn't necessarily predict how effective or ineffective they will be as mentors. And, I would say I also heard some really harrowing stories from people about their women mentors, not, because there is some either perception or reality about, I had to suffer through this and now so do you. So I think we have to sort of be careful about labeling people. But what is absolutely true are your experiences. So here's what I would suggest is write it down. Write down what your experience and how it makes you feel, because you won't always remember it. And the experience of writing it down can be very therapeutic, but it also codifies it. And you will come back to it as you go through this life, and you will be able to hopefully see how your experiences and your reactions to those experiences evolve over time. And finding, safe places to have conversations with others is really important. And I think that today, I would never have been able to give this talk 5 years ago. I would have been too afraid of the damage to me in my career. And at this point, I'm like, whatever, it doesn't matter. But, there are lots of people who get to be old women and old men and say, okay, one last shot, we really have to help others. So there are people around who are really happy and open to listening. And when we find people who don't feel threatened by what you have to say. So someone who's in a position where they have to be accountable for it is usually far less likely to be in a position where they can listen. So find the advocates, the allies, all kinds of words for it. But I did meet, what was one of the things that was heartbreaking is I met so many men who saw it, particularly men whose partners were women in academic medicine. And yet they felt powerless to do anything about it because the people perpetrating the activities were more powerful than they, and they were afraid of the consequences. And so there are a lot, you're never alone. That's the real message. And when you're looking for places to go, remember, you alone can't change the culture. So try to get a sense of what the culture is. Talk to the people who are there, make wise choices. And collectively we can change a culture. But, for example, one African-American showing up in a faculty of all white people doesn't change the racial equity in that department. So something to think about.
Dr. Sanchez.
Dr. Grandis, I just want to say outstanding presentation, JP Sanchez. I serve as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor for DEI under Dr. Romero-Wege. Also, please send my regards to Dr. Renee Navarro, just a great colleague and friend. Excellent qualitative mixed methods research. I love your sharing of narratives. I think Springer, please reach out to Melanie Sarah. I just put her email address in the chat box. She's helped me in publishing similar work in a book format. So I think your literary agent would have great success with her. My question is, did you notice any thematic differences between those study participants from basic science versus more clinical departments, or those individuals from typically undergrad departments versus our departments within a health sciences center?
I wish I did. I really, I don't know that I have adequate data to say definitively no, but I was stunned how equally awful it was at a low-ranked public institution and an elite privately high-ranked institution. You would have imagined that there would be a different climate depending on and every institution has its own culture. So I really saw little variability. The big difference in the clinical departments is it was more overt and accepted. And in the basic science departments, it was less full frontal, if you will. But I also think that, the business of clinical medicine creates a Wild West kind of atmosphere because of the unpredictability and the emergencies. So I'm not sure that I was so sad. I really thought, oh, maybe the basic scientists got this right. And I'm just, looking at the clinical scientists or the clinicians. And I'm like, no, it's not true. And I think it's, we're all people. At the end of the day, this is hard because we're humans. And in a culture where love and validation is so elusive, people hold on to whatever power they have. And sometimes that tenacious grip has serious consequences to harming others, and they can't see it. And because we don't talk about it or study it, we also can't really hold them accountable.
Dr. Cannon.
Yes, thank you so much. That was so interesting, informative. And I have to admit, I'm not so senior, but I'm a little bit discouraged because when I was a graduate student almost 25 years ago, still felt like so many of the same issues. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about how to approach, say leadership and I find this particularly difficult because I do feel like there are more people who are very supportive. Like they say they want to help. They say a lot of the right things, but that when push comes to shove, that, either the data or the specific examples just are not there, but nobody wants to be the villain in their own story. And I find it very difficult to approach either leadership or colleagues and say, I see this as an issue and what can we do about it? Because the issue really is whether it's hiring, whether it's, when I was a graduate student, I had a baby and my husband was in the English department at the time. As lefty as you can, as progressive as, you can imagine. And he wanted to take time off so he could be the primary caregiver. And they said, that's not allowed, right? Only women can take leaves of absence for this purpose, for family leave. And he was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm trying to support my wife so she can continue her program. And it took meetings with the deans. And, it's like, and it just felt like we had to call them out. But I feel like that's almost harder as a colleague. Like, do you realize you just hired 4 white guys in a row? Like, is that not a problem? I know we share values, but, when the data's there, but I guess how do you approach that kind of, situation without saying, no, you're not doing the right thing? Like, I do feel like that's very difficult.
Yeah, it is. Well, I love the example that you use because see how the world has changed? I mean, today, I don't think you would find an institution that doesn't provide parental leave and also doesn't provide leave for same-sex couples and people who adopt children. So I think we've come a really, really long way when it comes to gendered expectations of childbearing and child rearing. However, I think that, my sense is that we have to find language to talk about it that is honest, but not scary. So for example, if your last 4 searches ended up with white men, it's really reasonable to go to the person in charge and say, how did this happen? Can we potentially do a little root cause analysis? I mean, we do this in clinical medicine all the time. When we have a bad outcome or an outcome that's not desirable, we study it. And then we try to put measures in place to mitigate that bad outcome. So not that hiring 4 white guys is a bad outcome, but if the real goal is to hire more diverse candidates, and I heard this from many interviewees that, oh yes, we always have a woman finalist, but she doesn't always get the job. And I spoke to so many women who felt like we're just, they're checking the box when the interview is. It's an opportunity to really study it. So maybe if you approach the people who are in charge with the idea that we take these examples and we understand how it ended up that way. Are you not recruiting adequately, or is it not a welcoming environment? Maybe if there were women candidates, interview them confidentially and find out why they pulled out. What were the things that they saw? So I think that if the conversation isn't, all right, so I'll give you an example. I know we're almost out of time. We're out of time, but here's an example. I was actually, if you can find the words to speak up in the moment, it goes so far. So I was on an advisory board, and the people presenting, I had to talk about DEI. And they said, well, we've really solved the problem for women in academic medicine, so we're really focused here on minorities. I'm like, ding, ding, ding. No, I don't think you have, because each one of your presenters today was a man. And so, and then the response of the senior leader of the institution was, well, my wife and my daughter are in science and medicine. I'm like, really happy for you, but that doesn't mean these two things aren't true. So, you have to let them say their instinctive, it's not my fault. And then you have to say, but yeah, we still have a ways to go. So I think that these are hard conversations, but if we give ourselves permission to have the conversations, I think we will address the issues, but they're hard. That's why we haven't solved them, because we're human and it's hard. I know you guys have to go. Thank you so much for inviting me. I haven't given this talk before, so it was really a good experience. I wish I could be in Albuquerque.
Well, we'll bring you out and then you can come and chat with us in person. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who attended. And happy International Women's Day, everyone.
Yep. Bye.